Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful and thought-provoking episode of Processing Severance, our podcast after show. And before we get started, I just want to take a moment, along with my team, all of us here would love to thank all of you for tuning in, for commenting, for sending in your thoughts and questions over email, and just continuing to support us. So continue to share this podcast, whatever platform you're on, and make sure your friends, family, everybody out there who watches the show is tuning into this dialogue. So thanks again. Now, my name is Rasha G, and I am joined by my fellow Lumen team members, Mike M.
Hey guys, I'm live here from Woes Hollowed, reminding you that marshmallows are for team players.
Katerina M.
Hi, I'm Katerina, and I just burned my marshmallow. Sad to say.
You're not getting any more. Rob L.
Hi everybody. I've got some really bad news, but I can barely think there is a dead ceiling here and it stinks.
We'll try to take care of that as soon as possible, Rob. And Shadan L.
Hi everyone, I'm enjoying the company retreat thus far. I don't know if I'll feel that way an hour from now, but happy to be here and buckled in.
And buckle down for everybody who's listening or watching us. Again, before we continue, a reminder that you can send your emails to processingseverance@gmail.com. And you can always leave a comment on our YouTube channel as well. We are checking everything and look forward to hearing from you. All right, team, so much going on. This episode is titled Woes Hollow and is directed by Ben Stiller and written by Anna Oyang-Monch. And there is a lot happening in this episode. And before we get to this episode, I want to give a shout out to Mark Boyer, a Severance fan. Thanks, Mark, for writing in. Mark wrote in a little bit about the comparison to Cain and Abel and the contrast and comparison of that to this episode and what we've kind of been seeing develop in episodes, I would say 1 and 2 as well, right? And 3, well, 2 and 3 maybe, but we're seeing this buildup happening. So would anybody like to chime in on what Mark shared with us just quickly about maybe the religious aspect or what we're seeing kind of develop when it comes to strategies here?
I think we all know I'm a big fan of the Cain and Abel theory. Seth Milchek being named Seth, and Seth in this religious tradition being an inheritor of power after two brothers fatally struggle with each other, I think mirrors beautifully that Seth Milchek now at Lumen is being situated to inherit some power within this company. As far as Mark, your really insightful comments about the relationship between Natalie and Seth Milchek, I do think that the moment where Natalie presents Seth with the portraitures of Keir Egan, where they are reimagined and repainted with Seth now incorporated into that life cycle of Keir, I think there's a really critical racial dynamic that's going on in the scene with tremendous acting, because it isn't revealed in the dialogue, but in the micro expressions of these two characters. And I think it's important that we contextualize the kind of cult of Keir Egan within similar practices, Mormonism or Freemasonry or Scientology, and understanding that those histories typically excluded people of color until very recently. And then those traditions and those faiths tried vigorously in the last couple decades to expand, right, to open up. And I think the moment of poignancy when Natalie presents the paintings to Seth felt like a get out moment to me, right? Where Natalie's smile glitches or hesitates for a moment and there's a kind of pain or anguish. And it was the first time we saw Natalie vulnerable, I thought, in a beautiful and compelling way. And the way I interpreted this moment was, these two Black figures within the power structure of Lumen and within the Egan tradition having a moment of bonding where they are the outsiders who, yes, they've been invited in, but they've been excluded from this power dynamic, and they feel strongly about that.
And it's done with such subtlety. I thought that's what was so interesting. It's not blatantly in your face, right?
Yeah.
But you're able to see it. Thank you for that, Katerina. And then I want to give a shout out to Greg P, who a fellow refiner. We loved how you sent in your email too. You touched upon a couple of things, Greg, of course, the opening sequence and the white rabbit floating. And then we've got Mark S as a possible Messiah figure, also jumping back to the Old Testament and the goat concept further. Rob, do you have anything you want to chime in for Greg P? Because Greg had a lot of different things he wrote in about.
Yeah, Greg P, your email has really blown me away because little did you know that the five of us have been talking about how much this show has all these religious contexts and connotations. You've really hit the nail on the head because, and just I just want to read what he has said very briefly. Mark S is the Messiah figure. He went through a kind of atonement by fusing his innie and outie, right? So that's where we think we're going to be at by the end of episode 3. If successful, it opens the door to fusing multiple consciousnesses into one body. And essentially, Lumen could be combining all the Kiers into one physical, enlightened human body rather than being separately stored in the cold harbors of different goats. That is really spot on for me. I think that is where this show is headed. And I think that's very, very interesting that he brings that up. So I am constantly now looking for these this symbolism and how we can connect various theology and mythology that we have seen in various more recent religious movements, like Mormonism, for example, to see how whether we can crack the code of this show. Because right now I'm still really completely confused.
I think it's confusing all of us, but that's why we're here, Rob. And I think I just want to add on to that really quickly is, without getting too deep into it, is the fact that I didn't expect religion to come in so much into episode 4, or actually even in the series, right? I knew that it was a little bit there, but I think as we've gotten into season 2, you really see how prominent it is. So, I mean, hats off to the writers, and just I want to get into Dan Erickson's brain. Really, I mean, the way he's come up and created this entire thing. All right, my team members here. There is so much that happened in this episode 4. And I'm going to jump to you, Shadan. I think we were talking about a couple of different things, and of course, going along, the theme with the religion. But what are some maybe things that stood out to you in this episode?
I mean, definitely, as Rob and Katerina mentioned, I think the religious overtones become very overt in this episode, whereas before we're sort of finding Easter eggs, but this episode was very head on with the language, with the book. One thing I wanted to touch on that I think is interesting is 4. There was a lot of 4s in this episode. It's the 4th episode of the season. The book that they're reading from um was the 4th book. Let me pull up my notes, but I think there's a lot there in terms of the symbolism, in terms of having 4 main characters. Mike, if you want to go, and then I will.
Yeah, I mean, and 4 is also a very biblical number in a way. 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, for example. If we're working towards a project of some sort that Lumen's trying to do that could bring about the end of the world or the start of a new one, that's a huge possibility that's what that's alluding to, that 4. Yeah, I love that our viewers are touching on a lot of the old school Old Testament religious stories like Cain and Abel and Adam and Eve, because we're seeing a lot of that in this episode as well. We're seeing a lot of that play out. Certainly when it came to Kier and Dieter, Egan, we've got Cain and Abel kind of, motifs with those guys, those two brothers, and one of them dying a really horrible death, becoming part of the forest. And then, of course, with someone like Milchick wearing all white, and the rest of the MDR team wearing black, and then casting away Irv, at the end, it's almost like an Adam and Eve sort of thing where, people get thrown out of paradise. The vengeance of God is going down when you sin, and that's kind of what I took. So I think people are hitting the nail on the head when it comes to the religious motifs, and I definitely want to know exactly what it is Lumen's doing based off of all of this kind of God complex emotions going on, and situations going on in this episode.
Well, I think we're going to see more of that kind of unveil, because even in this episode, we start seeing a little bit more to the characters. Before we go into the characters, I want to talk about the white and black, because that was very prevalent to me. I don't know. I really kept noticing that in the entire thing, not with what they were just wearing, the wardrobe, but if we even look at the scene, the way the scene is set too, right? You've got these cutaways of the icicles of the snow on the mountains that happen to be very dark brown and black. And then I know even with the seal, which it took me like a couple takes, by the way, because I'm like, wait, is that a seal? Or I couldn't really tell if that was a seal or not, the way just it was shot. But the coloring in this was so important. And then even the way it starts, you know, how they were across on the mountains and walking up, and you see that silhouette of each single character, especially like with Irv, the way he's walking up the snow. So to me, there was this thing of lightness and dark, and it almost felt like, I don't know if it's redemption in a way for Lumen, but then part of me also felt like, is that Lumen trying to say, well, we shed the light, we bring the light to the darkness, and the four of you are in these dark places in your life, but we're going to help create that light. I don't know. This is just something that came to me, but anybody want to share what maybe what the white and black signify to them thematically as well?
I
was
think you
speechless.
said it so beautifully. I'm like, I'm,
Yeah.
I'm satisfied with that
All
analysis.
right. So
Now,
there's plenty of other things. So let's keep going in. I'm going to come back and share my love for Irv in this episode, Irving S. But Katerina, what was something perhaps that stood out for you, or outside? I mean, I know we've got the Cain and Abel thing going on too, but I'm sure there's a bunch of other things that
Well,
came up to mind.
it's so funny because I know last episode I was very much in my classicist religious themes. And now for some reason in this episode I kind of 180'd, and I love everyone's religious theories, and I'm going very like tangible and practical. What stood out to me, Irv in this episode, and then the wilderness, I wanted to present two theories. The wilderness I saw as potentially a digital realm, a holding realm for the consciousnesses of people that haven't yet been integrated back into reality, if in fact that's what Lumen's doing. So especially because we saw the twins or the dual representation of our characters, I wonder if there is a digital realm in which consciousness basically is held in a state of limbo or purgatory, if in fact the testing floor at Lumen is a holding place for physical bodies, right? Someone like Gemma who's been in a car accident, or someone like Kier who's maybe been able to preserve himself with ether. And in that line, when we get the passage about the twins and this kind of interesting and graphic decay of the twin, my mind immediately went to, if Kier in fact did preserve himself, whether through the topical salves that Lumen originally created as a fledgling company, or through the ether that Kier Egan, stirred in his cauldron. If his brother didn't take that route, or if the twin didn't take that route, perhaps what seems like a very gruesome folklore is in fact relating the natural decay of someone who didn't choose immortality, right? And a severing or a break between brothers, which plays into the Cain and Abel, or Robert, I know you brought up Romulus and Remus theory. So I thought that decay, the eyeball disintegrating, could have been a brother witnessing in horror someone he leaves behind who chooses death. And then my other theory deals with Irv, but I will circle back to that and pass the the red MDR ball to someone else for a moment.
All
Can I
right.
pick on something, Rasha? Can I pick up on something that Katerina just mentioned? Because I think we've all been making a bit of noise about how we think there could be people on a floor who are maybe in some kind of suspended consciousness, comatose stasis, whatever you want to call it. After just for full disclosure, I did some notes for everybody, and you've all come back with your own theories. Katerina came up with something really interesting about how the macro data refining and consciousness is something that maybe is linked. So if you look closely at the data being sorted, and I'm sorry, Katerina, I'm just kind of like lifting what
Take
you've
it
written.
away.
The four tempers, malice, frolic, dread, and woe, that really could lend power to MDR refining consciousness, making minds and souls adhere to Kier's ideology of balance. And then files expiring could literally be people dying on the testing room floor, the testing floor, and they've run out of time to reintegrate themselves. So this could be about a kind of a Get Out, the movie kind of scenario, or a religious scenario whereby Kia and his supreme followers, the people who are high up in the echelons, are in some kind of stasis, and they're waiting for they're in a cold harbor, and they're waiting for someone like Mark S and his people to refine their consciousness into the four tempers so that they're balanced and they can then re-emerge into the world. That really, really speaks to me. I really feel like that is something that we should keep our eye on as this season progresses.
Well, there is something to that. And I guess this would be a great time to bring this up too. You talk about reintegration, right? So, Mike, I'm going to throw this one out to you first. What about the scene? There's definitely something happening here as far as preserving minds and bodies, because we see that with Helly.
Mhm.
All of a sudden, there's that intense moment where Milchek is like, now, now, now. And you see her programmed back from being, the daughter, Kier's daughter, to or being a Egan. We
Yeah.
definitely see that dichotomy there. And I do remember in one of our other episodes, we discussed this, that she is not really showing up as a person as we thought. So, Mike, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, I mean, from the very get-go, my suspicions were the same as Irv's, because the Night Gardener and that story, why wouldn't she tell us the truth about what she saw? And it's the answer to that is simple. Well, I mean, it could have been, I suppose, like she doesn't want them to know that she's an Egan, but this group that she's been through everything with, she'd probably want to know that. I want them to know that, pretty immediately. So it did arouse my suspicions that she was probably the Audi version of herself, and I'm glad that we finally got conclusive answers to that in this episode with the which is a very interesting introduction to a new piece of Severance mythology, the Glasgow block, and what this is and how they're able to control people's consciousness. I think we've been touching a lot about potentially how Lumen wants to control these different consciousnesses of people, potentially for immortality purposes or whatnot. And now we actually have confirmation. And we've always kind of had confirmation because, the Severance protocol and everything like that. But now we actually have confirmation that they can do it like that, anywhere, anytime, not just on the severed floor. Although I do kind of love what Katerina said, this might be a digital world as well, like, or a floor, that we don't really know about, just because of the doppelgangers, the TV in the middle of nowhere not being plugged into anything, but actually playing the DVD anyways. So she could still be on the severed floor, and that's how they can control it. But yeah, it's great to finally get something concrete, a theory, that folks have been trying to address since the beginning of this season, officially addressed 4 episodes in. So great pacing, but also more questions about consciousness and the way that they're controlling, the Glasgow block on Helly. So that was shocking but satisfying for me.
Well, let's talk about Helly for a second, because I think we've seen this with Seth, with Miss Coble, and now with Helly, this idea that your proximity to power is a corrupting force, right? And so what I want to get into is like, what are her motivations here? Is she sort of drinking the Kool-Aid of her family, and is she sort of going along with it because it's survival, and it's using her proximity to power to get what she wants? Or is, in my opinion, the most emotional moment of the episode when she says to Mark, like, I felt ashamed. I didn't like who I was on the outside. How much of that was true? How
Mhm.
much of the physical connection that we witnessed from them was that, in my opinion, I saw it as something nefarious, maybe a means for her to control, manipulate. She obviously needs Mark for Cold Harbor, but is there a genuine connection that she may feel? Does she maybe see Mark as a way to get out of whatever trap she may be in? Where do you guys read Helly and her motivations as of right now?
Well, I think, Shadan, I loved your perspective on this, and I think you're right that it's probably not mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other. I agree that I think Helena presents as someone who is very power hungry. She absolutely seems interested in inheriting the mantle of Lumen. And at the same time, both when Helena laughed at the masturbation component of the creepy twin brother folklore and really had this like visceral mocking reaction to it that Milchek clocked and kind of shut down and said like, this is not the behavior I expect. Her reaction to that like masturbation folklore and then her fascination when she was watching the CCTV footage of Helly R kissing Mark and the way that she was so enthralled with what was really a simple moment, a lovely but simple moment. I have been interpreting Helena, in her espionage as an innie, as someone who, yes, is power hungry, but also potentially has been claustrophobic under the watchful eyes of her father, of the hierarchy of the Egans and of the Lewin Company, and sees Mark as, yes, as perhaps subhuman as an innie, but also a portal for her to express her sexuality or her independence in a way she can't in the external world. And Shadan, you mentioned something when we were exchanging theories that I thought was so insightful, and I completely agree with, which is when Helena says to Mark, I didn't like who I was in the outside world. I think that was genuine. First of all, I think this actress is tremendous. I think she was getting sexual liberation and to make a personal decision in being with Mark S, even though she still is the villain, right? And those two things can exist simultaneously. She's complex. She's a very interestingly written woman. So that was how I interpreted the scene.
And can I add something to that as well? If you think about this, when the four of them see the dead seal, they don't know what a dead thing looks like. These are very, very immature people who don't understand a lot of things that we all understand from our experience. But then on the other hand, Mark S knew how to have sex, and Helena is the one who is looking inward to these immature avatars who are just innies for her sexual liberation. She wanted to, that's how I saw it. I see that she is just as stunted as these people are in different ways. And I found that connection really interesting for me because I'm like, okay, so what is her motivation? She has probably many motivations, like many of us do. It's not just binary. But one of them is she wants to experience the love and affection that she's probably not getting on the outside world because she grew up in such a crazy environment. So that's something as well we have to think about.
I do think as well that there is some sort of innate cruelty to her. Irv kind of calls her out on it, obviously, later on, when she mocks him at the fire. But knowingly mocking the lore of Kier so that the marshmallows get burnt, so that they don't get marshmallows, would be kind of a sadistic thing to do. And if she really wants to get at her innie, the actual Heliar that we've known, what better way to do that than to sleep with Mark? So I think that there's definitely some sort of internal war that she has with her innie and herself, her innie with her. But there's also kind of a mean streak to her that I kind of detected, especially from this episode.
Well, I think not only are the four of these people sort of working towards whatever goal Lumen wants them to work, they're like workhorses, but I also think like they're lab mice and they're being watched. And to go back to like the idea of the four tempers, I think each one of the four represent a certain aspect of the temper. So if we have woe, that would be Mark because he's clearly grieving. Frolic and sort of the idea of joy is very much what Dylan embodies. Irv, I think, is sort of anxiety and apprehension, dread, which is one of the four tempers. And then Helly, I think, represents malice at this point. So one of the things that I'm going to be watching for is how do these four are they sort of confined to these temperaments that they represent, or is it going to shift as the series continues? And I think it's really interesting that each episode so far of the season for me, and you guys can tell me if you agree or disagree, has sort of evoked a different emotion. Like in episode one, again, it was very jovial, sort of kids going back to school. Episode two was sort of this eerie, dread-like episode with a lot of anxiety. Episode three was very thriller-like, especially with the ending. And then episode four was kind of this like adventure summer camp vibe. And so I think emotion and how they how it represents itself in the series and how it's being used to manipulate our characters is going to be a huge thematic element for me going forward,
Mm.
especially because the series literally starts again with somebody saying, look for numbers that make you feel scary. So I think like these innies are being watched and their reactions are being measured, and the way that they react is going to then play into whatever Lumen is ultimately working towards.
Well, they're definitely being watched. I mean, poor Irv gets kicked out, you know. Like I think that was so heartbreaking for me to watch. Because this in this episode, it was really interesting to observe how we see this character evolving even more and the strength that all of a sudden he's possessing and how he's really been very I think he's just been more attentive to what's been happening in with his Audi and being able to bring that in. Like I did love the scene where there were these moments with him where you know when he asked Mark S, "Oh, I'd keep a watch on her," or like you know he's expressing that I think she's lying. And then there was a moment with Dylan too where he said, "Oh, did you tell them?" Because
Mhm.
when they were you know Helly was coming down on Irv and some of his own insecurities, and there were all these moments and then I just I don't know, he had this like childlike but yet very courageous field as he went to explore more than what we were being shown or given with some of the other characters. How did you all feel about that? And I just wanted to give him a hug at the end of the episode, like, no, you can't go.
I wonder if he's
I
really gone.
No. They can't take him out.
I have kind of a crazy Irv theory. So I'm still on my goat chain, my Cain and Abel
Yes.
chain, and my Irv chain. And I had a thought occur to me. In this episode, I think there's a lot of indications that while we know that Irv had a military past, his dog being named Radar. I know last episode I'm playing off the idea of radar, submersibles, submarines, Cold Harbor, and then growing from there. In this episode, I think Irv displayed traits of someone who works in intelligence or espionage. The fact that he is not deceived by Helena, that he's really adept at picking up idiosyncrasies that everyone else was fooled by. The fact that he kind of brutally, submerges her in the water felt like a torture scene, like an interrogation scene to me. And then I had this thought returning to season one where we know that Irv falls asleep at his desk. And it seems so out of character with someone who's otherwise like disciplined and methodical. And I wonder if his Audi character, who we know is functioning in some way like a spy with a list of names of Lumen employees that he's tracking down, and has a military past. I wonder if that Audi is intentionally sleep depriving himself so that any Irv falls asleep at his desk, with dreams being a conduit or a portal for messages, because it's the only way that your inner and outer self could communicate with each other that the elevator code breaker could not perceive or stop. And we do know that they have a link because Audi Irv is painting, these terrifying black renditions of the elevator down to the testing floor. So I wonder if dreams are a mechanism by which Irv has been communicating with himself. And if so, it's confirming my theory that Irv is maybe not just a military man, but a spy, an infiltrator. And the last tidbit I'll throw in here, and I'm curious your guys' thoughts on this, is when Cobell in the previous episode approached Lumen and was about to go inside, and Helena presented her with, yes, come inside, we'll do a reset. Cobell was so freaked out, she turned and left. And I wonder with Bert and Irv's dynamic, them being older employees at Lumen who have been there longer than everyone else and have this immediate chemistry, I wonder if that chemistry isn't just organic, if in fact Bert and Irv have been at Lumen longer than they know or are saying, and that their immediate electricity with each other, or even potentially this shared combative folklore of the two departments being at war, is based on actual history, is grounded on actual history, and that there's a way to reset rebellious employees. And so Irv maybe has been at Lumen longer than we know and has been involved in rebellions, or at the very least is part of an infiltration. So there's my Irv theory of the day.
I like it.
I like it.
Mhm.
I think that reminded me too of that in the last episode when he drew the elevator, right? Because
Yeah.
he knew about the elevator where shipments went through and that was pointed out to him, and we haven't really talked about, like, that hasn't been visited a lot in some of the other episodes, but it was interesting. So for someone who's had a history at a company, they would know some of these hidden secrets or gems, right? And I loved how we saw a glimpse of Bert. So that also made me feel too that there definitely is something more to the dynamic between the both of them and Lumen, because it's Bert isn't just popping up just because. We're seeing him in certain positions, like inside with the innie and the outie, and I feel like I'm hoping that in episode 5 we do get to see more development between the both of them.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm kind
Yeah.
of
Especially with
speechless.
them working at the cubicle together, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's caught that in that episode, how they're outside and all of a sudden he pulls down the screen in
Along with the
a
along
second.
with the woe too. The woe's there too, typing away. Also at the cubicle.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yes. Now that was a very haunting little spectacle.
And like, remember when at the campfire, Milchick's telling the story about
Yes.
whatever her name is, or Woes something. Um, and he gets the book and he's like, shows everybody very clearly what she looks like. I mean, it could not have been more obvious that we as the audience needed to take note. It was a short, ugly old crone type character. And then, of course, Irv sees her in his dream at the cubicle after Bert has lifted down and up the screen. And then she wakes him up with some scary kind of jump scare situation. What is this? What does this mean? Obviously, crones and older women who are kind of decrepit is a trope that we've seen throughout mythology and literature over the centuries. I would like to explore that more in future episodes, hopefully. Hopefully, we'll get a few more clues about what that actually means.
Well, did you notice
So
did it seem like she was wearing a bride outfit or some type of a
oh
veil?
She
yeah,
is. She's
it was a bright outfit.
the bride. I think in the book, right? The
Yeah.
4 characters. Robert, I want to hear you. You introduced a theory about John Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress that has a lot of
Yeah.
kind of interesting, iconic characters that I want to toss over to you in a second. But I think in the episode, the characters of this folklore story that are introduced to us, one of them is the decrepit bride, right? Kind of like she's zombified. He doesn't use that term. I'm using it. But Rasha, yes, I think it is very much supposed to be a wedding veil, and this withered, decayed bride. But Rob, I thought you had introduced the possibility in conversation of the bride, and then there's like the jester-esque character. We have, of course, this goat, potentially being these obstacles or pitfalls, Shadan, like you're saying, the 4 tempers that have to be balanced or tamed or contended with on our hero's journey. And I'd love for you to share some more of what you
Yeah.
I thought was really fascinating.
So here's where I started, and I must disclaim that as an atheist, and I'm not making any judgment about any religion. I think we are all very conscious of not to hurt anyone's feelings. This is just an observation from my own personal viewpoint, and so take it as you will. Firstly, I saw a lot of connections between what we saw in episode 4 and Mormonism. And the Book of Mormon is similarly exalted by its followers. It's a religious text. It was dictated, just like what Kierkegaard is doing with the fourth appendix, and has a number of doctrinal discussions on subjects like the fall of Adam and Eve, the nature of Christian atonement, eschatology, the end of the world, agency, redemption from physical and spiritual death, the nature and conduct of baptism or rebirth, the age of accountability. Like every single thing hits on something that this show is trying to explain, I think. The purpose and practice of communion, personalized revelation, anthropomorphic and personal nature of God, again, and the nature of spirits and angels. So then once I started thinking about that, I was like, okay, this felt like a pilgrim's progress or a pilgrimage to find something, to be enlightened about something. By the way, at the tallest waterfall on the planet, I kept thinking that is absolute nonsense. But why would he say it? But anyway, so then you think about the Pilgrim's Progress from this world to which that is to come. I have to read that because it's such a long heading. It's a 1678 Christian allegory written by John Bunyan. Many of us are generally familiar, I guess, with it. I haven't really read it, but if you read through what that is about, it has a lot of similar allegorical, I can't even say it, allegorical connections between what we're hearing from Milchick and his story, or the story he was reading, and this Pilgrim's Progress that keeps coming up in these newer religious movements like Mormonism, like Scientology. So yeah, I mean, without going into too much detail, I would just suggest our listeners and watchers go and do a bit of research on what the Pilgrim's Progress means, and I think you're going to find a lot of similarities there, which really took me aback.
I was going to say, one of the things that occurs to me when I was introducing my wild goat theory with the scapegoat from Leviticus and abandoning the goat to the wilderness. In the Leviticus text, the wilderness can be interpreted either as sacrificing the goat that the sins of the collective are put upon to the wild, or it is Azazel. And there's some contention about who Azazel is or what it is. Azazel can be interpreted as a demonic or dark force. But interestingly, Azazel can also be interpreted as a precipice or a cliff. And Rob, when you say, the tallest waterfall in the world, it also brought to mind in the Keir life cycle, the very iconic image we keep returning to of Keir on the precipice overlooking the waters, that then he introduces Seth into the painting, which I think is a get out moment. But the fact that we see this image of Keir standing on a cliff, on a precipice, over an expansive wilderness, to me, I think of like white supremacist, manifest destiny in the Old West in the 1800s. But now I also think of Azazel, right? And the idea of, if my goat theory has any tether to reality, with Lumen, that one of the goats is flung from a precipice, or somehow our sins or our waywardness is connected to a waterfall, a cliff's edge, and here we see Keir on it. So tossing that into the iconography soup.
Mm.
While we're talking about religious symbolism and everything like that, if I may, I do kind of want to go back a little bit into the idea of four horsemen of the apocalypse and the potential links that could be very apocalyptic from Lumen. If you guys kind of do a little bit of digging into what the four horsemen were, there's a white horse, a black horse, and we get white and black here, a pale horse, which could be the woe, and then a red horse as well. If the white horse is supposed to symbolize pestilence, we've got a lot of health motifs here. If we remember Cobell and like the oxygen mask and all this other stuff, plus also what happened to Dieter Egan kind of seems very much like a disease of some sort. If we think about war, in this episode, the four are actually fighting against each other in this. If we think about death, we've got the dead seal, as a symbol of death in this. And then if we think about famine, they mentioned several times that they're starving and they're hungry to the point where they're about to eat the dead seal. So I feel like there's a lot of different symbolism here that might actually lead into something or allude to something apocalyptic that might be tied to Cold Harbor. Plus, also, one of the books in the Bible that does talk a lot about the apocalypse, ironically enough, is the Book of Mark. So there you go. I think maybe
Fascinating.
what's that?
It's so fascinating, Mike. You're so like, there is so much eschatology or apocalyptic imagery and symbolism in this show. It's particularly in this episode. It really opened my eyes. I think you are 100% onto something about the four horsemen of the apocalypse. That never really occurred to me, but it dovetails with this idea of the whore of Babylon. And the reason why I bring it up only is because when Milchick's reading the story by the campfire, he talks about the temper woe. By the way, this is the words because I had it on closed captioning. A gaunt bride, half the height of a natural woman. So she was a bride, and she spoke to me directly from her eyes and said, "This is your doing. You suffered his wantonness." So obviously, we're talking about Dieter. he's no one's brother, only chaos's whore. Now, the wantonness is bad behavior that shows no regard for consequences, and it can be a lack of restraint or control, something that I think Keir Egan has talked about in the past, about trying to balance and purge bad things. But also the whore of Babylon is a symbolic female figure and a place of evil mentioned in the book of Revelation in the New Testament. And it's all about carnality and sexual immorality, dominion, and the persecution or death of saints. And the whore of Babylon, or the devil's church, consists of all organizations not associated with the followers of Christ or that are against his followers. So it's like this moralizing about outsiders or other religions or other denominations that do not fall within the scope of what Keir Egan and Eganism is supposed to represent. And to me, that maybe telegraphs a battle that might be coming in future that they're preparing for, and that Egan will come back out of his cold harbor and who knows what will happen. But yeah, I think this whole apocalyptic stuff is key and critical to the narrative of this show, and we have to keep an eye on it as well.
And Rob, we've already seen that there's sort of this tension between unsevered people and severed people. So there's sort of this, I don't want to call it a civil war, but maybe perhaps that's what's brewing, and maybe it is going to lead to some sort of apocalyptic. I had never taken it that far before. I didn't think that's where this was going, but now I'm like, is it really going to be the end of the world? And are they trying to create these like emotionally evolved beings? And that's why there's such a focus on feeling and reactions, and why you've sort of isolated these four people and are pushing their buttons in the name of sort of a corporate bonding retreat. But it's really, I mean, the opposite.
Well, I think war is interesting, Shadan, that you're bringing up, and Rob too, in like a visceral way, because we remember the catalyst for Keir creating this ideology, what I refer to as a cult, is that he witnessed the horrors and the graphic violence of war. And there's a quote that I'm going to butcher, so look it up directly from this show. But essentially, he says, in the ravaged bodies of the soldiers, he found that the war was internal, that the battle was internal. And then, of course, he had this epiphany that the soul was, in fact, 9 essences that were good, and then these 4 tempers that need to be tamed. I think the 4 tempers, we can agree, is very clearly cleaved from Hippocrates' 4 humors. But the 9 elements of spirit could also correlate to a biblical 9 fruits of the spirit, right? Different, but I think the numbers are relevant. And in terms of war, again, oddly, in this episode, I went very tangible and very practical, reversing from my religious iconography in the previous. I thought a lot about this return to the water tower that we see in front of the Lumen building. And if in fact, Lumen is trying to upload consciousnesses, to revive some of the Egans of the past, I also wonder, there was this moment of a focus on teeth. We returned to bodies and decay in this episode. And Milchek had introduced Helly R's first like human fact, being that she has weak enamel. And Lumen also had a display of teeth on the walls, of smiles, and Dylan commented that he was missing a woman's smile on the wall. So teeth, enamel, why these subtle tie-ins? We also see the water tower. I'm thinking, if in fact there is going to be some external conflict, water is a great way to disseminate drugs, right? We use it for fluoride in our population. I'm pro-fluoride, to be very clear. But if you had a nefarious element that you wanted to integrate into a city, you could do it through their water system. We already do that. And it would make sense why they have these teeth or enamel studies as kind of a play. But yeah, I think there could be a tangible battle where, Keir Egan's goal is to have himself and his followers have perfect balance in these 9 fruits of the spirits, 9 elements, and to rid themselves of the 4 tempers or humors, and thereby, Shadan, as you're saying, have this kind of perfected life force that he is at the helm of.
Wow.
That was so.
You remember, sorry,
Go ahead,
Rasha,
Rob.
remember Cold Harbor? Cold Harbor, it was one of the most significant battles during the American Civil War. We talked about that in episode 1. More war iconography, just in the background. But I think maybe we're being fed all these red herrings, and the creators, Dan Erickson and Ben Stiller, are just pointing and laughing at us like complete morons.
It's just
I don't care.
We're throwing you off. But in this episode too, if you think about war, right? Like we're discussing here how there's an internal war with each of these characters too. I think this was one of the first few times too I felt they were at war with each other as well. I mean, up until now, we've been seeing this whole teamwork come into fruition and working together and really helping one another decipher things. But in this episode, I started feeling a little bit of animosity, and it really becoming a one for one. I mean, even with Helene and Mark S, right? Like you do wonder what the motive is there. If it's just a pure, like just a one-sided motive for her. And then for him at the end, I thought it was interesting too, where we see that flash of Gemma's face while he's with Helly. That to me kind of threw me off too. I didn't really expect to see
Yeah,
that.
yeah. What
Well,
do you think?
I felt like, okay, so if Milchek was able to do something with the chip for Helly, was there some type of malfunction happening with Marcus? And that's why he was seeing the faces? I don't know. Or if there was that something that the innie and the outie are now battling at. And so that's why, because it did take him for a second, right? For a ride, like, oh, wait, what's going on? And she even asks him about it, but then he just lets it go. But that did occur for a reason. And I think we're going to see more of that unfold because we do know that Gemma is alive somewhere. Her body
Yeah,
is being held somewhere. But going back to you know, if you think about the Civil War as well too, I think just looking at the way this entire episode is set, the the production design of it with the temperature and just the chaos within each of these characters and the war theme, it does take me back to a lead up of, I don't know, there's definitely going to be some chaos happening more. And I wanted to bring up too that still the theme of control and power is circulating within me because that scene too, when they were sitting around the campfire and Milchik just took away the marshmallows, and you can't have a marshmallow for laughing. I mean, it's supposed to be a delicate moment, right? But even that moment was so prominent into bringing in the recognition of, please remember who's in power here. We are the ones who brought you here. We are creating this community environment, whatever it is. We know, I don't know.
yeah.
Anyone else want to chime in on
No,
that?
you're right. And don't forget, Miss Wang fired up the grill and
Oh, Miss
brought
Wong.
luxury
Yeah.
meats. Copious luxury meats. Who says that?
Oh yeah.
And she was playing the theremin. What the hell are we watching? What is this retro, outdated, frozen in time aesthetic that they keep going back to? I mean, I love it. I'm here for it. I want to consume it constantly. I love it. But what the hell is going on? Who says copious luxury meats? I've never said it.
I've never
I
heard.
think like the historic speech, I love that we get moments from different, like clearly in the real world, we have very contemporary technology, but then we have outdated cars and we have outdated computers. And then we have speech like in the goat room, where I think
Yeah.
is clearly like 1900 is not contemporary at all, which I still am clinging to, then the belief that we have somehow preserved some folks from the legacy of the Egan lineage, whether it's the Egan themselves or their followers. And that's why there is this disjointed vocabulary from one character to the next. Even Milchek, it's not just that Milchek and Miss Wong are well spoken, they're well spoken and also a little bit out of date. Like the vocabulary is gorgeous, but it also does seem a little antiquated at the same time. And Rasha, when you brought up chaos and control, I just wanted to throw in another world ideology that seemed prevalent here, which is prior to Abrahamic religions, the in Egyptology, the two central conflicts of the world, instead of being personified, well, they were personified in deities, but if you really boiled them down, it was chaos and control. Those were the two forces rather than good and evil. And I know that it seems like, Kier, it's not just a religion, but it is an insidious, obsessive, pathological, down to the numbers, down to the 9 attributes, down to the 4 tempers need to whittle and mold himself and his legacy and what could be more controlled than this, you know? And I'm curious how that plays out when we get back above the surface, you know, in the chaotic real world where things are unpredictable.
Well, we're
That's right.
On the
going
And
same
into episode. Go ahead, Rob.
oh, just quickly, Mike, and then I'll throw over to you. Don't forget as well that when Milchik says um, Glasgow block,
Mm.
we think that's about the coma, the scale that surgeons use, and anesthesiologists use, but it's also the Glasgow effect in social psychology, a phenomenon where people tend to conform to the opinions of others, even when those opinions are clearly wrong. And I'm sorry to say this as a bit of an outsider, but we're seeing a lot of that happen right now in contemporary politics, particularly in Europe and the United States. And it was famously demonstrated in experiments conducted in Glasgow and highlights the social and psychological factors that can influence our perception and understanding of reality. And so that that's another intentional little Easter egg thrown at people like us who are delving deep into all the stuff that we're seeing and hearing. And I think
Mhm.
there is some yeah, I think that's a really good point. So, but sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say as well, just the idea, the concept of what the MDR team does on a daily basis kind of ties into the idea of chaos and control. Here are all these little numbers across the screen. We're taking them and we're putting them into little boxes like we're organizing them. But when you remember and take a look at Irv's dream, the console that he's seeing, the numbers scatter all over the place. There's the chaos. They turn into letters. And if you look very closely, the letters are E, G, A, and N. So obviously it's an Egan, thing. But they also start forming little visuals as well. You can kind of make out the silhouette of a head and then the silhouette of an eye at one point in time. So I think obviously out of that chaos that's going on the screen, it's the reminder that you're always being watched, you're always being controlled, and who are you being watched and controlled by? Egan, which I think is ultimately what tipped him off to the idea that Helena was Helena, and not Helly R, saying he shouted at them, she's an Egan, Um, even if she was an Audi, how would he know that she's an Egan if not for that prophetic dream? The Egans are watching. You've got one right there. She's a mole, I think that's kind of it's introduces chaos to shut down their control later in this episode. So I think that
I
was
love
that
it.
was quite interesting.
Well, we're going to be heading into episode 5. So, Shadan, quickly, what's something you'd like to see in episode 5?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, they deliberately brought these four to sort of isolate them and cause tension. I think maybe they thought it would benefit them if the four of them weren't as close. But one thing that really stood out to me was Dylan. He has this sort of visceral reaction to what happens to Irv, and he apologizes to him. So how does that come into play? And did this plan of Lumen's backfire? Like, are the four, or are they going to actually be working together or sort of avenging Irv? And is that something that we're going to see in episode 5? As I mentioned, I'm really curious to see sort of how the emotional reactions of our characters play into the plot. I mean, we saw again sort of Dylan meeting his wife. Are we going to see more interactions between innies and outies? And what does that mean? And the biggest question that I wanted to raise to you guys, you mentioned sort of, is Ben Stiller laughing at us? We have to talk about the fact that Severance has burned through more plot in 4 episodes than a lot of shows have in entire seasons of television. What does that mean? Is that, and we know Ben Stiller has already confirmed that season 3 is in progress. Are we burning through a lot of plot because there's only going to be 3 seasons and we have a lot to get to? Or is it because the things that we have seen so far, as much as we've dug into them, maybe they're not even that as significant as we think it is? So that's like the pacing of the rest of the season, I think, is also going to be incredibly significant.
Yeah, it definitely picked up. Mike, what are you hoping to see or uncover in episode 5?
Well, I just hope Irv's okay. I want to see him in the next episode and just have a confirmation that they didn't take him in the woods and just full on Lenny him from of Mice and Men,
Yeah.
and that's the big thing that I'm really hoping to take away. But we also left episode 3 in a really big cliffhanger with Ragabi and the reintegration process. So that's definitely keeping me asking, where's that going? We saw a little bit of that glitch with Gemma's face on Helly, and I think that might be tied to what's happening with his
Yes.
reintegration process. So let's see how that plays out a lot more for Mark. and yeah, kind of go from there. So really more Mark and more Irv is what I'm hoping to see.
Katerina?
Oh God, I want to see Irv. I want to, Mike, I'm with you. I love Irv. I want to see that he's okay. I'm like nervous to watch the next episode. I also, in vein of what Shadan and Rasha you brought up in this episode, about the childlikeness of our innies, the innocence and the naivety of them. And also Gwendolyn Christie's naivety, in the goat room, her character immediately greeting outsiders with suspicion. I have been thinking about these pouches next, and I wanted to throw out this crazy theory that I wonder if the innies, we see their sexual immaturity. It almost felt like virgins when we had the tent moment with Mark and Helena. And I wonder if the pouches that is part of the folklore of Lumen is actually innies witnessing pregnancy, just a regular non-cloned human pregnancy for the
Hmm.
first time. And if that's the case, because a pouch of your body with an entity inside of it is a pregnancy. And I wonder if this wild theory is somehow the case, what does that mean about how excluded and segregated Kier's followers have been kept from reality? Potentially not having any outies or any context of the outside world, and interpreting things like sex or pregnancy as mythic or terrifying. So I'm curious about that interplay between any naivety and outie sentiments.
You're all blowing my mind. I've got a few quick points just from what you've all said. The childlike aspect. Remember the next chapter in the book that Bilchek was reading is Kier and the Thieving Nanny. Thieving Nanny is a trope recurring in fiction over and over again, playing on anxieties surrounding the vulnerability of children. We see this in QAnon. We see this in all kinds of mythologies. And I think if these people in the Lumon world are sequestered and have been for many years, then of course eganism is going to demonize caregivers or anything from external forces that may impact the balance that they're trying to achieve for these people. So that's where I was with that. But looking at the next episode, I because there's such a dump of mythology, very welcome, by the way. I was looking at this more just in terms of my film school background and just in the way that this episode was shot. It was so beautifully rendered, cinematography, editing, that haunting piano cue, the warmness of inside the tent when Helena and Mark are doing the thing, and then the coldness of Irv running through the forest. I'm hoping for more of that because we don't get to see a lot of that when they're inside the severed floor. Yeah, I'm just amazed at how beautifully rendered this show is. This show is not only operating on a completely new level in terms of mythology and narrative, also in terms of its creativity, its aesthetic. There's nothing like this. And every frame is so pitch perfect that I'm looking forward to more of that as we go forward.
I'm so with you on that, Rob. Even the way it's filmed, like if you'll notice some of the characters or where we'll see a side shot, there's some shots where they're not fully in frame, right? We're capturing the way the visual and the angles are captured. And we didn't get too much into it, but music to me was really pivotal in this episode. I feel like you said, the piano keys, I mean, and where the music is chosen to be played. And I think that really dictates a lot of how we feel in in the episodes in general. I know that plays into a big part in filmmaking, but I feel like with Severance, because of the coldness, the starkness of it, you've got these moments that, from the warmth to the coldness too. It's just interesting. So I love how the music plays out. I actually want to see more what happens with Helly, how we are now going to see her connection to who she is, with the innie and the outie, because in this episode, we clearly saw that there was a stark difference in her recognizing even more of who she does and doesn't want to be. So I'd like to see that evolved a little bit more, and then even learn a little bit more about the goats coming back into the office, and seeing really what that entire environment was about. So I want to just take a moment and thank my entire Lumen fellow members here, Rob, Katerina, Mike, and Shadan, for another amazing, amazing discussion. And thank all of our viewers and listeners. Thank you for joining us on Processing Severance. This is getting intense. So make sure you grab a cup of tea or water or a drink wherever you are next time you tune in. And again, we do look forward to hearing from you. So that email again is processingseverance@gmail.com. We're on your podcast platforms as well as YouTube and on Instagram. So make sure you follow us and let us know what you're thinking. Thanks for joining us, everyone.